I'm doing. Thank you, everyone, if that's okay.
Thank you, reminder.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. So what we'll be going through today, just by way of background, you've got Leah and my name's Rowan. We're two of the currently three within Regen Farmers Mutual, although there's a kind of a bigger group of farmers that kind of helped to catalyse it. There's a steering committee of 20 odd. And so, as I kind of mentioned before, my backgrounds are originally investment banking. The last 10 years been working a lot with cooperatives and mutuals and in the conservation finance space. So kind of working at the crossroads of the emerging environmental markets. Unfortunately, from an agricultural perspective, we're missing Wardy today, who's got the agricultural background. His father was one of the pioneers in the holistic and regenerative farming space in Australia. He kind of educated thousands of farmers across his career. So don't ask me any kind of deep questions about farming, because you'll discover pretty quickly I don't have much of a... I'm good in the field I know, not necessarily in the farming context. So I'm going to take you through a set of slides. So I won't be able to see you, but like if you put up your hand or put it if you want to pop a question in the chat, and I'll keep an eye out there. We can kind of maybe break it up a bit if you have a burning question or feel like you want to kind of explore something in more detail. Okay, so we're this is good for the farm, good for the farmer. Regen Farmers Mutual. And so what we'll be doing today is talk to two things. One is I'll just take you through quickly like an overview of environmental markets, what they are, carbon markets, provide some sort of context about what's emerging in that space. And then we'll step into kind of more specifically how it relates to farmers and landholders. And that's not working. So environmental markets are more than just what we read in the news being carbon. Carbon is the kind of the benchmark currently, but even that it's a small market. Last year the total market size was 226 million, and it's forecast to grow dramatically, basically. So the Carbon Market Institute forecasts the market to be 10 to 24 billion by 2030, and they're kind of assuming carbon prices will be $30 to $50 a tonne, whereas they're kind of currently, they're currently anywhere from 15 to 25. So markets are expected to grow dramatically, but they're also expected to kind of diversify. That people are looking for more than carbon and recognising there's more than carbon with respect to protecting our environment or responding to our environment. So you would have been hearing a lot about biodiversity through COP26, but we're in the midst of a need to kind of address biodiversity, a biodiversity crisis, basically. And similarly, there are other environmental markets. So particularly in your area, there's interest really in around flood resilience, for example, type outcomes that can be achieved through environmental markets. And then there's kind of emerging elements with respect to animal welfare or whole of farm. And one of the key problems that we kind of identified really early on is that most farmers are too small to access these markets. It's really the province of very large farmers currently. So just to give you a sense of what you're hearing about in the news, this on the right-hand side, you've got the chart of the carbon price in Europe, and you can see it's gone up rather sharply over the last couple of years. And that chart, and the point of that chart was to show that really it's government regulation that's been kind of driving demand in Europe. And so as new regulations have come in, they've required more and more emitters to buy more and more carbon. And so that's been driving up the price of that. That was the start of the carbon market. So in US and Europe, they've got what's called the compliance market. So they basically require those companies that emit emissions to offset those emissions. Whereas in Australia, we don't have a compliance market. We don't require our major emitters or our emitters to offset their emissions. So that creates a different type of market dynamic. One of the key outcomes, of course, is that, and desired outcomes, is that we're leading to higher energy prices. So you've seen in Europe, gas prices have followed a similar shape to this year, and that's an expression of, if we're going to want to tax fossil fuels to encourage people to move to other types of energy sources, then clearly we're going to see higher prices for the fossil fuels, because that's the outcome that we're seeking. In Australia, the carbon price has been following a kind of a similar trajectory, as you can see on the right. That's a spot price. What that means is that's the price for freely traded carbon in small volume in our market. And so that's gone up dramatically in recent times. The price at which the government has been buying carbon credits has been around about 16.75. So that was what they recently entered into agreements with sellers, most recently through the auctions in October. We'll come back to that in the sense of, but the point there is that the way that the Australian market works is we have an emissions reduction fund. The government created a big fund, put lots of money in it, and said, you guys can go out there and buy carbon. And so you get that fund to buy carbon from the market. It doesn't require emitters to offset their emissions. What it does is it creates an incentive for people to create schemes to sell carbon to the government. So it's a different market mechanism, and it creates different outcomes. And what that also doesn't necessarily sponsor so much is it hasn't been helpful in sponsoring the rise of a voluntary market in Australia, as you'll see. So this is a chart on the right of the growth in the carbon market. So you can see the blue lines are the size of the market in any given year. And what you can see is that the blue is the emissions reduction fund. So that the Commonwealth government has been, well, the buyer of carbon in our market. They bought 95% of carbon last year in Australia. So it's very much a government-dominated and one government-dominated market. But voluntary buyers are beginning to emerge. They're the green ones there. And so what we've seen globally, particularly, so out of the west coast of US and in Europe, since the beginning of this year in particular, volumes have ballooned with respect to voluntary market. We're only starting to see those flow through in the Australian market. And so that's being driven, of course, by corporates becoming more responsive to consumers and also their employees with respect to what they're requiring them to be responsible. So the way our market works, because we have this very much government dominated, the voluntary market is more price sensitive than it is in other parts of the world. And so what that means is that typically voluntary buyers in our market tend to buy just a tiny little bit of Australian more expensive carbon, and then they buy lots, and they mix that with lots more cheap carbon from overseas. So you can buy carbon from Cambodia or the Ukraine for $1 or $2 or $3 US a tonne, whereas in Australia it's clear it's costing $15 to $25 to $30 a tonne. So that's indicative of kind of the nature of the market in Australia. Corporates are looking to buy cheap carbon, but then they kind of blend a little bit of Australian carbon in to create a story that they can kind of present. And we don't think that's particularly sustainable, but that's just the way the world has been to date. And so here it is, that market kind of summarised again. So you've got the emission on the right-hand side here, you've got a table. This is the Emission Reductions Fund. That's them buying $180 million worth of 226 last year, $1 million worth of carbon credits. And down here you have the voluntary demand, and the voluntary demand of purchase of Australian carbon credits was much smaller, 900,000 tonnes, and a lot more, offshore carbon emission receipts. So, and you can see that they were priced at $1.79. So, like for like, that's the voluntary market kind of the 15 plus $15 million. So that's the nature of our market. What we've had to date is one government buyer. We have had little in the way of voluntary buyers, and by virtue of the fact that that sellers have been typically large corporates or large farmers, it means that small farmers can't access the market, and it also means the market structure is set up to inhibit growth. So there's very high transaction costs, and the broker intermediated market is one which kind of promotes opacity and differentiation. It doesn't head towards standardization and trying to reduce costs. So it's not a structure that's ideal for how are we going to achieve that massive growth that people are expecting? So we are seeing markets move beyond carbon, and you're seeing it in the government level. So what's happening is, at the Commonwealth government, you've seen recently the biodiversity stewardship scheme that you might have heard of, or the enhanced remnant vegetation scheme that the Commonwealth's currently got in the market. They're about supporting biodiversity. Similarly, the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland, it's about paying for co-benefits, so paying a premium for carbon that delivers other benefits, whether it's biodiversity or cultural benefits in the case of savanna burning. And we've seen the emergence of similar schemes, or are currently seeing the emergence of similar schemes in other states. So Bushbank and New South Wales, for example, are on the cusp of announcing similar schemes where they're promoting these carbon plus type outcomes. So there are, so what we've kind of indicated there is that, like, we're in a market that's growing, that's kind of diversifying, but it's got some real problems. And there are some catalysts that, you can see catalysts for change in the wind. One of these is this idea that, like, people are looking for, carbon plus co-benefits. So we're looking at markets recognising that carbon's just part of the solution. We're seeing that there's a push for transparency and standardisation, for example, from the Commonwealth government. When they're $4 million, they're put into a trading platform, which they think will help small farmers access the market. And we're also seeing things like the Marketplace for Nature, which is an initiative that the Farmers Mutual is part of, with the likes of the Nature Conservancy and the Pollination Group. And its objective is to look at ways of creating markets beyond carbon, and to kind of create a common language between buyers and sellers with respect to how we actually go about communicating with, the way environmental markets should evolve. There's also, if you're interested, the Carbon Farming Foundation in WA, I kind of recommend them. They're a non-profit foundation that's been set up to assist do-it-yourself type approaches to carbon farming. So, long story short, the market structure is basically, there's a market failure. The current broker intermediated market is one where brokers take anywhere from 30 to 80% under some structures of the total revenues of a carbon transaction, for example. And these brokers are motivated to maximise the margins through promoting complexity. It's not in their interest to try and find ways to standardise and promote transparency so that we can actually drive prices down, and so farmers can retain more of the value. And so this led to the creation of the Regen Farmers Mutual. This process started kind of the start of last year, where we kind of had some sense, because we're working in the conservation markets and Wardy's agricultural background, we had some sense that the market was broken and there was a need for change. Under the Cooperative Farming Together program, brought together about 80 farmers, conservation organisations, government, to kind of work through the problem. And out of that, we went through 3 series of workshops where initially we kind of worked through the problem, tried to identify what the solution might be, came to understand the idea that if farmers came together to create their own farmer-owned broker, then that would create a kind of a market change in the market paradigm, basically a way to disrupt the current market. And so then out of that came a willingness from a group of farmers to push ahead. And again, under the cooperative farming program, we ran a program around understanding how you'd go about what the business processes this kind of business would need to have, and what things the farmers would need to agree between each other in order to create this the mutual, this farmer-owned vehicle. So that created a set of principles and a business process that kind of are embedded in the mutual, and we haven't got them here today, but when you look at them, it's a major point of differentiation with any other broker in the market, because it truly is farmer-owned. It doesn't just represent farmers. Farmers actually are driving it. So it goes everything from one of the principles is the mutual has to support local groups on the ground and start with the local, and then right at the other end, in terms of at the last step in the business process is the mutual needs to support the idea that farmers have control of their data and their destinies, and so everything in between. So this series of workshops enable us to understand what the mutual might look like, how we might go about scaling it. And out of that came a willingness kind of from the steering committee to create the mutual in May, and as of July, the mutual was formed. And so its major kind of objective in life is to kind of break the market into a new way of working. And the idea is that farmers retain 80% of the value of transactions, that 10% of a transaction revenue would go to those groups and advisors and supporters on the ground that provide support to the farmers to deliver into and create environmental transactions, and that 10% of the revenue of transaction then just goes to cover the costs of operating the infrastructure required to support farmers in this market. So the idea is the mutual becomes a pacemaker. It's a market setter. It shapes the market and brings the market to a more competitive place so that farmers can retain more of the value. So that's the end of section 1. Should we pause and stop for any questions, or I'm happy just to dive into the kind of next stage, but if anyone wants to put up their hand at this point in time or throw something at the screen. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Nope.
Excuse me, Rowan, when you're talking about a broker, is that someone that comes in and leases your land and grows carbon captured plants or species on your property, and you're just leasing your land out to them? And then is that what a broker is? What is the broker? Okay.
No, so a broker is it's like this, a mortgage broker is a broker. So
yes,
there's someone who intermediates. They're a middleman, basically.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I understand then. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
And so, so the difference we're talking about here is, rather than having middlemen, we're creating a farmer-owned broker. So it's actually representing farmers. So we're actually removing the middleman, because now we can negotiate direct with buyers.
Yes.
So it takes out
as a mutual thing. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you, Karen.
That's okay.
All right. Let's plough on then. Plough on we shall. Okay. So, and this is words from Wardy's father, actually. So when farmers are pursuing the business of growing produce and food and fibre, there's actually two components to it. There's an economic profit, in the sense if you're trying to make a quid, but there's also environmental profit. So if over time a farmer is degrading the quality of their land, that's not actually farming, that's actually mining. And so the idea is a regen farmer is someone who actually derives both an economic profit and an environmental profit. They're actually contributing to the health of their land over time. And so what the objective in the mutual is to try and help farmers to achieve both an economic and environmental profit. And so what you'll see is that the mutual will try and help farmers and farmer groups understand what the options are with respect to land management practices and how those land management practices interact with the environmental markets, so that you can kind of see how those two things come together to engage in environmental markets and to kind of execute transactions in that space to get paid, whether it's getting paid to plant trees or to undertake soil carbon or to do something else on the spectrum. So here's an example of something else. So the ANU Sustainable Farms has done a lot of work on farm dams, and so conceptually one product that could come out of the environmental markets is financing farmers to rehabilitate their dams. So rather than having the bare dam kind of expiring methane in the atmosphere in the paddock, you can kind of put a fence around it, do some biodiversity planting, put a course in for livestock to access the water, and create a biodiversity zone. So the benefits are, adding to the biodiversity, mental health for farmers to see an oasis out there. There are greenhouse gas kind of benefits to the environment. Now, as I say, ANU Sustainable Farms done a massive amount of work on the data demonstrating the benefits behind this, and we can see that the banking market is flipping from a world where up until now banks have been really sceptical and have viewed kind of environmental transactions on farms as diminishing the value of the farm. And we can see we're at a point in time in the not too distant futures where banks are going to flip from viewing the world like that to viewing land management practices and farming practices being a net positive, where they're contributing, this environmental profit, this environmental good. And so this is a case in point where we can see a product where farmers are probably self-financed to do rehabilitation work around their dams. And the loan itself is paid off through the environmental good, as opposed to the environmental service, as opposed to the farmer having to pay cash.
Can I ask a question there, Rowan? When you say that the land value is being impaired or diminished, is that because a lot of these projects have their 25-year or 99-year commitments, so to speak? Yep. What it is. So whenever you enter into one of these agreements, you're obviously, there's going to be that, let's call it a charge or a mortgage or whatever it is on your title going forward. Is that correct?
And then the bank has been looking at that going, well, you're diminishing the productive capability of the farm by setting aside that part of the farm for non-farming purposes. Right. So that has been the view up until now. And we speak to all the major banks and we can just hear, really interesting, talking to a major property valuation company yesterday, and they go and they're close to the banks at the grassroots, and we are, and they can hear it as well. They can go, look, the banks are moot. You can see a day in the not too distant future where banks will go, all right, well, what are your farming practices with respect to animal welfare? Because that they're responding to the pressures of the coming up through the consumer food chain, so to speak.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. It's really is an inflection point. This is good. This will bring that point out. So great case study. Claire Cannon, awesome person, a pioneer in this space. But so she has a farm down at Womargama, and what happened was there was a highway, freeway, whatever, being built down, not too far away. They needed to get some biodiversity offsets. So it was the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, or the Nature Conservation Trust as it was at the time. And they came to her, and she had some box gum on her property. And so she was able to put a fence around that box gum, do some additional carbon plantings around it to create a biodiversity offset, to get paid for that. But then, like, under that management plan that she has with respect to that biodiversity offset, she can still sustainably graze the land, because that's what you want. You still want your cattle going through, or your sheep going through, to kind of to keep it in check, so to speak, to keep it healthy. And so she, not only was she able to generate order of magnitude $250,000 through the environmental market transactions she went through, carbon and biodiversity, she's also been able to then sell her product through premium markets, through Kate Grimm, direct to restaurant for beef, and her wool goes to ZQ, which is a direct to Italian high-end premium markets. So, and she's been able to do that partly in recognition of the fact she's doing good on a farm. So she's been able to leverage that goodwill, if you like, or that premium, that provenance. And to your point about the diminution, they did a property valuation relative to before and after they put the biodiversity offset. And I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but there was, in concept, the property valuer took, I don't know, it was order of magnitude 150, 180,000 off the value of their property because they'd put a biodiversity offset in, which was clearly less than what she generated from a cash, from her carbon transaction. But interesting, great example. So to, like, the different types of transactions you can get into, one's standard carbon. That's in a sense the easiest to conceptualize, and it's the kind of the most prevalent, if you like. And that's the idea that Greening Australia goes around and plants trees everywhere. And the way that market, being again government dominated up until now, works is there's a model called full cam that the Commonwealth government have, where they've effectively mapped the country, and they've pixelated it and they've gone, parts of the landscape are going to be high value with respect to planting trees, and other parts of the landscape are going to be less high value with respect to planting trees. So they actually, because government's buying the carbon credits, they actually determine what they're going to pay for different pixels, if you like. So what we can see is on the next page, where it's blue, the government won't pay a hell of a lot, basically. So they'll pay 22 tonnes, $22 per hectare. But where it's red or orange, they'll be prepared to pay a higher amount. So effectively, sorry, that's not tonnes per hectare. That's actually the amount of carbon that they're implying is on that particular part of the land. So where it's blue, they imply that there's less carbon, and where it's red, they're on their calculations, you're going to generate 271 tonnes of carbon, carbon equivalent per hectare on that space. So what that means is, according to that model, if you plant a tree in a red space, you're going to generate a whole lot more revenue through the carbon markets than you would relative to planting in the blue space. And so that's on the assumption that you grow a tree to being 2 meters high and it has 20% canopy cover. So that's the standing carbon market, if you like. One of the interesting things about this is we can do things like what the Regen Mutual kind of brings a different dimension to these markets. So when you talk about carbon markets currently, it's typically one person, a corporate farm owner entering into a carbon transaction with one kind of buyer, if you like. What we can do is we can create landscape scale impacts. We can bring groups of farmers together to create an impact across a landscape. And so in this particular landscape, we're working with the Loddon Plains Landcare to create an east-west biodiversity corridor. And so we're going to see how we can plant trees along these orange and green bits to connect two populations of birds. So we'll be looking to maximise the revenue from carbon markets, but at the same time generate a net biodiversity outcome that will also have value to philanthropic investors, for example, because there's these two populations of birds who never get to talk and they never get to multiply, basically. So
just on that, how do you access that mapping?
Full cam, there's if you go into CSIRO, there's a tool called Looksee, LOOC-C. LOOC-C. I don't have it.
That hyphen, the letter C?
Yes, it is the letter C. Okay. So it's LOOC, the letter C. If you Google Looksee, it should come up. We'll send you the link after the webinar. But so Looksee is the model that CSIRO have built that sits atop the full cam model. I'm not sure it brings up maps that quite like that, but you can do a map of your landscape and get a sense of what the opportunity is from a standing carbon perspective and from other methodologies too. Yeah. We're going to come back to that because that's one of our kind of endpoints, actually. So it's
okay. No, that's good.
It's a good point to kind of talk to. Another type
Giving you a break, that's all.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. And others. Soil carbon. Soil carbon's really, and this is where, like, I'm going to be parroting words that Andrew's used, and I really don't even understand what they mean. So anyone who wants to chime in, feel free to do so. But like, basically, as I understand it, the world up until now has been fixed fences. If we move from set stocking to time-controlled grazing, we allow, through using electric fences, we allow for better management of the landscape with respect to our cattle and livestock, such that there's more organic matter in the soil, and so that that soil organic soil carbon increases in mass, and we know that soil carbon has been declining globally basically for particularly the last 50 years. And so the idea behind soil carbon is that you create a baseline, you measure your soil carbon today by having samples at, on any given property, on 3 or 4, on depending on how large it is, sites. They become representative of the soil carbon in your soil at that point in time. And you want to demonstrate over time that you're actually increasing the soil carbon content. And you get, and under the Commonwealth Government's carbon methodologies, they will pay for that additional increase in carbon in your soil. And that's got to be the worst explanation ever of soil carbon. So what, in terms of soil carbon, one of the things we did see last year was the first major transaction in Australia with respect to it. And so this was this transaction you might have heard of with respect to Wilmot. And so it was Microsoft bought $500,000 worth of soil carbon credits from Wilmot, which is owned by Murdoch kind of related entities. It's a farm. And it was the transaction was kind of intermediated through this kind of blockchain actual network in the States called Regen, the Regen network. Now, what was really interesting from our perspective was the way Microsoft approached it. So Microsoft did this really wonderful thing where they've kind of open sourced their learnings from their process. So this the transaction itself represents 1% of the total that that Microsoft the carbon that Microsoft set itself to acquire, to offset and to turn from being net zero to being to actually being carbon positive. And so, but what they did was they actually they documented their learnings through the process, so that other corporates could learn from their experience, and that they could actually kind of help to accelerate the market. So this is what this is the kind of activities that will help us kind of achieve that kind of pricing and standardization. And it's in the buy side, the corporate's interest as well, that we do get that standardization. It helps with respect to credibility, but also helps with with transaction costs, so they get better value for the type of transactions that they enter into. It's again another thing that we've discovered with the mutual, that there is a bit of a vacuum. That the level of engagement we have had with both government and corporates has been astounding, given that we're a startup. But so there is this vacuum with respect to being an entity that's truly representative of farmers currently. So as I kind of talked to earlier, this idea of carbon plus is really taking hold. So the idea that particularly corporates are looking for more than carbon. And they're looking for the story that goes with it. And so they want to be able to demonstrate that either there's biodiversity benefits, and they'll pay a premium for doing so. And so hence that's why the LRF scheme in Queensland, for example, is paying a premium. But even in the voluntary market, corporates will pay a premium, which implies that there's a price for biodiversity already. And so this is what we see is the kind of the way, one of the major ways that the carbon markets are likely to grow in the short term, the medium term. So these co-benefit markets, in terms of what we're seeing in terms of activities, that we're working with the Food and Agribusiness Network up near Gympie, and they're at the forefront. They're putting together a transaction that's looking to go into the LRF, so that Land Restoration Fund, leveraging the Accounting for Nature methodology. So Accounting for Nature was set up by the Wentworth Group of Scientists, and it's come up with a methodology that enables the benchmarking of biodiversity effectively. And what it really does is it just goes, it looks at a block of land and goes, what's the state of that land relative to what its state would have been 200 years ago, recognizing that 200 years ago it might have been its kind of natural state, if you like. And it says, well, if it's better or worse, like if it's like whatever the condition is, it kind of indexes it to that point 200 years ago. And so what this transaction is looking to do is to say, well, how can we incentivize landholders to go from one level of biodiversity to a higher level of biodiversity using the LRF methodology, using the LRF payment process. So that's kind of indicative of this emerging co-benefit market. So just to give you like a summary, therefore, of what does the mutual do? What it helps groups of farmers, because we kind of work at that local level. It helps groups of farmers first one, understand what the opportunities are in their landscape. And so that's on their farm, but also collectively, what is the kind of what are the priority outcomes that could be achieved through environmental markets. So a great example there has been working with Landcare in Bellingen, looking at, we put up a proposal, the NAB Foundation, actually, it was around flood mitigation. And the idea was bringing together 3 different types of farmers or landholders across their landscapes. So in the upper river catchment area, it was a soil carbon transaction, which was about building up soil organic matter to increase the water retention in the upstream, so to speak, to reduce potentially the flooding that comes downstream. Then in the valley, it was about replanting vegetation, building up the riparian areas to slow the flow of floodwaters, and also to generate biodiversity benefits. And then at the coast, it's about creating inland biodiversity connectivity, because at the coast it's suffering from not only flooding coming downstream, but also inundation coming in from rising sea levels. So and so together, while independently, each of those transactions might be able to occur. One is a soil carbon, one is a biodiversity / standing carbon, one is a biodiversity type transaction. Bringing them all together, we can create a flood mitigation kind of outcome, and then going to talk to New South Wales Transport and say, look, there's been a flooding event, I don't know, 12 out of the last 14 years in that region. Every year you spend millions of dollars fixing roads, cleaning up roads. If you pay this amount here, it's kind of like an insurance premium, an option premium. You're reducing the risk and the impact of flooding, because these are the outcomes we can deliver by bringing these farmers together to do these things on farm, or landholders on farm. So that was just by way of example of, we bring farmers together to understand the opportunities both on their farm, but in the landscape context, to define transactions so that we can kind of come up with an indicative term sheet. This is the transaction that we think works in this context. So it's not the other way around, where Greening Australia and LLS go around saying we want to plant trees on your property. We're actually starting from the other way around and saying, well, let's bring landholders together to understand what the opportunity is as you see it, and then take that to the market. So it's going the other way around, and we're going to New South Wales Transport saying, and they've responded amazingly favourably to this idea. So the idea is you take the transaction to market. It might be a regulated market, it might be a voluntary market, we might be creating a market. We take that to buyers. The mutual can negotiate those terms, and then it enables the execution and delivery of those transactions. And that's through the digital platform. So, okay, so I think I've just tried to capture this, and I'll try and accelerate through this. So mutual enables that collaboration at local level. We've now got like 20 odd transactions, they're coming together in different regions at different stages. And we've just spoken about the flood mitigation one. We've got biodiversity corridor and the one in Gympie. But in addition to that, there's kind of interest from industry groups to have certification with respect to specific practices within their industry. Carbonate's developing an ISO food certification to demonstrate, that the impacts on food from regenerative farming. Okay, so to bring it all to a head, so where to start?
Thank you.
The idea behind this, the idea for as an ideal place to start is to help farmers to understand the opportunity. And the way we're coming at that is to go, right, we've designed, we've piloted this product called the Environmental Farm Assessment. And effectively, this is one of the advantages of the mutual, effectively what it does is enables farmers to collect data, and landholders, data on their property. So, there's 185 questions that like a farmer will fill in. There's some data that's input by an independent assessor or advisor that comes on farm that does some biodiversity, land cover, ground cover measurements, for example. Those two data sets come together in a way that we can then have provide back different views of the environmental value of that, of the assets on that farm from different perspectives. So we can provide an indicative value with respect to accounting for nature. So we can grab accounting for nature's algorithm, run it over the data without ever sharing that data with accounting for nature, so that the farmer can have, all right, this is the indicative kind of opportunity with respect to my biodiversity kind of on farm. We can do things like we're working with AgForce, and they've got an ag care whole of farm methodology. Can we provide a whole of farm kind of feedback to a farmer with respect to animal welfare, for example, as part and carbon emissions? And then we can also provide a view with respect to the carbon. So whether it's standing carbon or soil carbon. And so that's to your earlier point, integrating with Look-See. So we're working with the guys at Cyro. So integrating with tools like Look-See to provide, a way for farmers to kind of get this snapshot of what their opportunity is on their farm. Really interestingly, this creates a digital twin. This creates like a virtual farm, if you like. What you're doing is you're creating a data set that represents your farm. You've got control of that, and no one else. And we've been having these conversations most recently with the Commonwealth Government, and it was a light bulb went on in their head. They went, "Oh, right." So the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Stats, when they do an analysis of the urban land, environment, they start at the individual businesses and they aggregate the data up, and that's how they come to a view of the economy.
I'm on a phone call, so I can't talk now. Thank you.
Sorry. So when the ABS, they aggregate up, and the light bulb went on for these people because they said, "Oh my God," because in the agricultural context, everything's done at the macro level based on measurements that might be satellite. It may be, hand measurements were taken 10 years ago. So you've got very low fidelity data with respect to the opportunities, the environmental opportunities, and in landscapes. And as I say, the light bulb went on. But oh my God, this would become a way that we could get high fidelity data, high credibility data at the farm level. And our job now is to find a way to incentivize those farmers to, one, get it, and then two, to share it with us in a way that they're comfortable, but we can then generate insights with respect to fire management, with respect to, like those landscape scale outcomes with respect to, biodiversity and what have you. Very cool. So, okay, so that's what it is. Step one is this environmental farm assessment, which enables, creation of a digital twin. The next steps, if you like, through that process of entering into environmental transaction, we understand this will take time, is to kind of map the different outcomes that could be achieved by undertaking different land management practices, basically. So what it calls that landscape agronomy, I assume that's the right term. The idea is that you want to be able to model, if I do put these trees there and I do these things with my soil and I do X here, what would be the impact on my production, and what would be the impact on my from an environmental perspective, and therefore what would be the kind of the economic and the environmental impacts. We've got projects, I won't go into today, around taking these contracts. So we've talked about how we want to standardise the way this market works and standardise the contracts. That then enables us to take those contracts and put them into the kind of on-chain, into that blockchain kind of environment, which really then starts driving the value of that digital twin. And where this is all going and why this is here is that we see that these environmental markets are transition markets. Ultimately, a lot of these prices, a lot of these impacts are going to be priced into the produce that farmers, that comes off farm. So you can think of it about the difference between barn and free range eggs. There's a price difference. Well, that's going to be reflected across every product as we get this, this kind of wave of environmental markets washes across the agricultural sector. As data is collected, and it's going to happen anyway, so we want to find a way for farmers to control it. But as that data is collected and we get higher fidelity, there's no doubt that across our supply chains, there's going to be differentials between the price paid for this food produced this way versus produced another way. So I hope I've done that justice, but this is, so that's the Farmers Mutual. Where we're at, we've got two things going on at the moment. we've got we opened a wait list for this environmental farm assessment about a month ago. And the idea being we wanted to try and get a sense of what the demand was from farmers for this product. And like we've got 230 farmers on there now. We haven't really spoken to anyone about it for the last kind of couple of weeks because we've been busy doing this other thing, which is we're undertaking the fundraising to enable the kind of kick off the development of the mutual. So it's being done through the Regen Digital, which is about enabling farmers to invest in the digital technology that kind of underpins this. So we've got these two things going on at the moment, but like for anyone who is interested, we would love for you to hop on the environmental farm waitlist. It obviously doesn't cost anything, but like it really is, it's an indication of whether you're interested in that idea of getting an environmental farm assessment. And ultimately where that goes is we want to be able to kind of, and someone's just done it by the looks of things. Ultimately where that goes is we want to be able to, in the landscape, kind of find ways to identify those landscape scale outcomes so we can start kind of structuring those transactions we can take to buyers to optimize outcomes at that kind of level. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And you can fire questions at me, and congratulations to whoever signed up if that was one of you guys.
Thanks so much, Rowan. I think that was very beneficial, really informative. Yeah, that's quite exciting. And I really love how it does tie into provenance at the end. I think that's pretty crucial. You get, and I don't know, as a farmer or seeing this stuff, you get a bit nervous that people just farm for credits, which ultimately loses the purpose of farming in a traditional sense, which is to feed people. But it's great that we can add some cream on the top for the benefit or the good practices. So yeah, hopefully that will make things easier for people and understand it. Thank you.
Just a heads up, all the links that people requested or were discussed, I've put in the chat for you. If there's any that have been missed, please let me know and I can put some more in.
Good on you, Leah. Thank you.
It's okay.
And Rowan, I'm here, mate. So
well done. You're back.
yeah. Sally took the boy to hospital, so I'm back on the Zoom. Yeah.
Just
Tag team.
Great.
Can I ask a question? When you essentially market or transact with these units, which are to be generated through these programs or projects, quite a lot of the properties in this region quite small. So is one of the benefits it is that you're pooling a series and are you doing that nationally and you'll have a biodiversity fund, or are you doing that regionally whereby I need to get half a dozen people around me to make it worth your while? Can you just tell me a little bit about how that would work? I can understand, essentially what you're doing is collectively bargaining against the buyers. So you can probably put together a portfolio. Can you just tell me how that works?
What did you want to have a crack?
Yeah, mate, you've been carrying the can for the last 40 minutes. Thanks, James. So each farmer sort of enters into a bilateral relationship with the nature fund of the mutual. And then, they're a co-party to a landscape scale impact within their area or within their industry. Now, there's another point which you raised, which was, that problem of most farmers are too small unless they aggregate to even get an individual transaction off. And so we enable those basically to syndicate so that they're a deal that can get into market at a reasonable size. You're right about the portfolios. So the underlying environmental assets of carbon or biodiversity that we have locally might be best priced if we sell it locally with that sort of narrative and those sorts of impacts being done locally, or it might be, best done through a voluntary market that's seeing some other sort of benefit. We've got the ability in the Nature Fund to kind of stack carbon, biodiversity, and other measured and verified outcomes, and sell them to the market, for the best price that we can get them. And then automatically 80 cents in the dollar of that transaction goes to the farmer, 10 cents in the dollar of that transaction stays with the farm group, and 10 cents in the dollar of that transaction stays with the mutual for having done the broking and the technical governance stuff. The other really cool thing about that structure of individual, regional, national is around collateralization. So if you were a farm, you normally get like 70% of your ACCUs issued because they hold 30% in lieu, essentially, in case you have bad years or don't deliver, etc. So when you have to have that as an individual, but you're pooled with another group of farmers in a similar location, you've got some cross collateralization. And when you pull that area with another area geographically distanced or in a different environment, then you've got some collateralization across the group. So that helps us manage the risk at the nature fund level and be able to get a better return for farmers, because we've got a better risk profile and would normally be over collateralized in that term.
Yeah. So the 70%, the 30% holdback, you wouldn't need to do that, or you because you can demonstrate that your portfolio, is diversified enough that it would, not need that, and you may only have to hold back 10% or something, or
hard to say what those figures are, but conceptually that's the idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Ryan, you were going to say something then, mate?
Yeah, I was going to talk to that idea about smaller properties, and it's come up around the Coffs Harbour area. So I'm just kind of interested to see whether this is a similar kind of experience. It doesn't have to be about making money out of environmental markets either. It can be about delivering an environmental outcome that you want for the area and getting finance to do that. So that's the same thing. It's just not with a monetary goal in mind. So and that just came to mind by virtue of the fact that, as I say, in Coffs Harbour, there was they were experiencing some pushback about the idea of, one, who are these environmental credits, who are the carbon credits going to? Was it greenwashing, what have you? And so that's part of, well, if we're talking to New South Wales Transport, that's a like for like, that's a local, you're benefiting, the person buying and the person selling are kind of generating a local benefit. And the second thing was, well, they had this experience, where Greening Australia and LLS had come on and had been pitching this thing locally, which was around, we'll do biodiversity carbon plantings, but they kind of said it wasn't really biodiverse. It was like, here's these 6 plants and we're going to plant them in, and it was regardless of what was needed in the local landscape. And so it's kind of the idea of turning it around and kind of starting with, well, what is it that our local landscape really needs? And then understanding that to drive the outcomes that you want seems to be intuitively a better way to approach it. And that's what we're getting from both, talking to people like Tilt Energy, they get it. They need to buy offsets. Talking to people like New South Wales Transport, they get it. They go, right, yep, that's going to change the way we can do things.
James, does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just on that you raised a really interesting point, and that is the financing. So how would that work in that sense? You would use the potential credits in the future, and you would, get finance against that sort of thing
to do the work. So that's like, you're talking about the difference where we're going to do some work today, but the outcomes are going to be down the track. Is that what you?
Yeah, I mean, look, I can only speak from my own experience here, though. But in this region, when you said returning it to what it was 200 years ago, I mean, a large part of this region was rainforest. In fact, it was the big scrub, the majority of the Byron Shire. So, and actually our property, I'm not sure about others on the call, but, sits right within the middle of that, with riparian zones and whatever. But if we're true to our word and we have done replanting and whatever, but if we really want to, create greater biodiversity, it's probably meaning replanting and replicating in the rainforest in places. And I guess one of the impediments to that, unless you're, very, very wealthy, is that it's actually an expensive process, because I've done it. And it also requires quite a lot of maintenance for the first probably 5 years. In fact, the maintenance is more expensive than the actual planting, to make sure you can get it established. And I'm talking about taking things that are essentially now, pretty much cleared land, put it that way. Yep. So that'd be the thing that would be a starting point. I would think, I don't know, Andrew could comment on that, but that's one of the starting points around here, along with obviously the soil carbon and the regenerative farming practices. Yep. So that particular, I think that's one of the big issues, is the cost impediment of that.
Yeah, they're my feelings exactly. I'm 100% in agreement with what James is saying. I feel exactly the same way. I would love to manage and regenerate my land, and I'm looking at possibly getting the credits to help me finance that down the track so I can continue on with it, because I've got limited funds too. So that's a really good point James made.
Yep. So that there is our process throughout this. It's been this co-design process, and so effectively what we've been doing is we started with one problem, and we've kind of, the solution to that's the mutual, and then as we step in, we kind of just begin to understand as the deeper detail. That's another problem. How do we address that? So the problem we're talking to here is kind of like that. It's feasibility funding, or it's upfront funding. How do you fund the upfront costs to achieve an outcome where the outcome's not going to be for somewhere down the track, if there is going to be environmental outcome. So where we've been kind of exploring that is this idea of, it's more philanthropic funding, or no, there's two ways of coming at it. If there's an environmental transaction, if there's a carbon transaction or a biodiversity outcome that's of value to a corporate buyer, then we know that there's appetite for those guys to pay some money up front. It's kind of like an option premium to be able to buy the future carbon, the future credits that come out of the whatever's being done. So in a sense, what they're doing is they'll finance some work to firm up a project, if you like, up front, so that they can get the outcome down the track. So we know there's appetite for that, but it depends on the circumstances as to how that's kind of expressed. The other way it's being expressed is through philanthropy. So there's the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network. They're working with Sustainable Table, and also the World Wildlife. I'll recommend this: the World Wildlife Regenerate Australia campaign that's being launched next year. Now they're looking at exactly that type of problem. So they're looking for local projects, and they're really excited about the mutual as being a catalyzer for local projects. But they've only got $2 million a year, and they're going, well, how do we maximize that? So $250,000 a quarter to help catalyze projects. Now that's probably not going to go a long way in terms of kind of the work that you're talking about there, but what we're trying to say is, what are the stages a project needs to go through to get it? So there's a kind of an environmental markets outcome where there's someone paying for it, and the project starts with the concept, and it gets developed over time, kind of becomes more detailed, and we need to find a way to kind of finance those early steps to be able to get a project to the point where there's a term sheet we can take to the market, if you like. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I can see your model being applied in this manner, because say, our property, we might say we want to do 10 hectares or 20 hectares, and, individually, that's pretty difficult. There is a couple of operators out there that are doing something sort of roughly like this. But if we could do sort of like a regional collective, and we got, 20 people with 10 hectares, all of a sudden you've got quite a decent amount. And again, you get your diversification because it's across, a number of different farms, etc. And then potentially that is something I'm thinking, you could take to market. To be it'd be more, I'm guessing, I'm not sure, but it'd be more, specific to potentially say this region. And it might be, make sense. It's probably very, valuable to even an operator in this region, even someone like Norco Dairies or something, to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some interesting work. I don't know if Liz, if that's you on the call. The biodiversity team in council have got some recommendations on wildlife corridors and some mapping around that, which I guess is to guide people if they are taking on these types of planting, with the hope of linking things up a bit, so it becomes a collective, not just patches here and there.
Yeah.
Which I guess would add value again.
Yeah.
So it might tie into all that, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Wildlife corridor mapping can just be another thing that sort of supports those kind of programs. And if people are looking to do planting, it helps sort of direct where you should go, what might be beneficial, how to link people up across the landscape. And the intent of it is to support those on-ground actions.
I might just also say there's ANU is working with several banks around a dams project. So retrofitting existing dams so that they're fenced appropriately, have a biodiverse zone, maybe some nesting boxes. And the cost of creating that biodiverse dam and the, in diesel and bulldozers and, appropriate remediation, whatever that is for that particular dam, that can be financed on no interest or low interest loans through banks. And ANU is looking at something like that, which might also be appropriate in some of those farms that you're talking about that are small hectares, but those water sources are precious for the animals, native and domestic.
I just want to say I've got to go. I've got someone else here. So thanks very much for your time. Thanks, Andrew. I registered. That was me. Yeah, let's see where we go. Thanks.
James.
Bye.
All right. Yeah, unless there's any more questions, I guess we're pretty good.
Pretty done.
That's good. It's 10 past. We've actually gone over. So I appreciate your time, everyone. That was
Thank you so much.
No, thank you guys. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, great. And we've got this as a recording. So look, we'll put it through the network a bit further and people, great to have those questions. Thanks for chiming in, everyone. Yeah, we'll keep spreading the word and collectively we'll see what we can make happen.
Yeah, sounds great.
Thank you.
Right.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Enjoy the rain.
Do you want to end the recording?